And welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 247, Who is the Savior of the Union at Gettysburg? Last week, we took a more in-depth look at the wheat field, a section of Gettysburg that is one of my personal favorites. If anything, I certainly feel better of having righted a wrong from our main narrative, so thank you all for having accommodated me on that. This week, we will continue to talk a little Gettysburg. I figured that we would have a fun topic and a little bit of a different style episode. We will discuss who deserves to have the title, the Savior of the Union Army at Gettysburg. Before we do that, though, let's talk about Patreon content. And of course, we do have some Gettysburg-themed Patreon content this month. We did a picture slideshow of Gettysburg monuments. We've done other monuments before on different battlefields throughout the country here. But this one, we specifically stuck to pictures from monuments at Gettysburg, and I just kind of went through a couple of the ones that I thought were kind of memorable from all 3 days. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, there is a link in the show description. And we have other picture slideshows of different battlefields. We've done movie reviews, we've done memoir reviews. Next month, we're actually going back to a memoir review. We're doing 13 months in the Confederate Army. So somebody who was pressed into service in the early part of the war. If that sounds like would interest you, once again, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. I think I have teased this subject for quite some time if you have been listening to my episodes. Seemingly, there's always an argument to be made for one moment, one individual, one set of events at this pivotal battle of the war that is the one that will keep it a Union victory, and thus likely save the army from maybe destruction, and if we stretch that a bit, the Union itself. Depending on what day of Gettysburg we are talking about and what Confederate success actually comes to fruition, though, I think we should point out that it would be questionable as to whether the Union needs saving. Certainly, if, say, Pickett's charge and the attempt on the Union Center is successful and the Federals are forced from the field, that might have been bad, and maybe there could have been additional capitalization by Lee, but it's just as likely that Meade is also able to extract his army, mostly intact, from that situation, and maybe he even gets back to a line he wants to fight a battle on in Maryland, and Lee is still kind of in a pickle. But why does that matter? Well, normally, how large a Confederate success could have been does not, because we really only care about what occurs. That's really the point of history, right? But for the exercise today, it actually matters a great deal. If we are to whittle down who does the most, or who has the biggest impact to the Union victory, then we should also consider the actions that could have been catastrophic should it have gone the way of the South. What I am trying to say with that is that we need to get into some hypotheticals and what ifs, so there is going to be a lot of that in this episode. That is not to say it will be entirely based on what might have happened, though. We have plenty of evidence from a lot of our prime candidates of decisions that they make and actions that they implement that have direct influences on how the battle unfolds, so we know exactly how things turn out, so we should also consider that as well. I want to make the note that while I will give you a list and supported details for each of these individuals, I will not really be providing my opinion for this episode. I want you to come up with your own opinion, and then perhaps I will reveal mine, and we can compare notes, so to speak. We'll go ahead and have a sub-episode where I will discuss my thoughts on the matter. The great thing about this exercise, though, is that I am not entirely sure there is necessarily a right or wrong answer. You could have a variety of different opinions. So there is some beauty in that. I think maybe a combination of one or two could also be valid. Although a cop out would just be saying everyone because I mean, it is true they all combined to win the battle, I guess. But what I mean, I have done my best to scour my notes and come up with a roster of names, but it is also likely that perhaps I missed somebody. So that is definitely a note that I also need to make, in that I do have a list of names. Most of them are names that you certainly have heard of before. So if you are of the opinion that it is, in fact, David Ireland who wins the Battle of Gettysburg on Culp's Hill, and some of you might be listening and you could be saying, who is that? Then perhaps I have not gone deep enough and I apologize. But again, I said, I didn't necessarily list off every single person here on this list. I have hopefully come up, though, with some strong candidates. And again, you can agree or disagree. Maybe this list is too surface level. So for that, I do apologize, but we are going to ride with what we have. I did come up, though, with 3 categories to provide some kind of organization. These categories are main contenders, dark horses, and honorable mentions. So let's go ahead and talk about our main candidates. Now, as I've already sort of gone over, I think there could be an almost infinite number of options or combinations that we could come up with. But in my estimation, this is the list, but not without some controversy. Our first name is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. How does this list not start with Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain? Certainly, if Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was around, he would start the list with his own name. Chamberlain and the 20th Maine are on the flank, the last of the line, on the Little Round Top. They will fight a duel with the 15th Alabama of Law's Brigade, which, to be fair, did also march a big round top before making contact with the Bay Staters. Famously, the 20th Maine will refuse their line, run out of ammunition, and then have a bayonet charge, capturing some of the Alabama troops and securing the flank of Little Round Top. Now, if you have been listening to me for a while, then you probably have the impression that I think Chamberlain and the 20th Maine are a little overrated. Their stand is impressive, so we should not take that away from them. But as recent histories of the battle have pointed out, there are a few problems with Little Round Top and its defense. If the 20th Maine is pushed back, it is hard to imagine that the lone 15th Alabama is able to take the hill entirely by itself. If the Confederates are able to add artillery to the hill, then the effectiveness likewise would be limited. But also, for the sake of argument, could they have started to roll up the Union line? This is a possibility. Chamberlain does make sure this doesn't happen. Is Chamberlain the beneficiary of not being on the front side of Little Round Top that sees a lot of officers killed or wounded by effective sharpshooter fire in Devil's Den? I think that is a good bet. We can also probably think that the morale boost to the Southerners by taking the hill would have been pretty big, even if it would not have been strategically less important and costly to do so. We also have to take into consideration that additional 5th Corps and 6th Corps troops show up in the latter stages of July 2nd, so they might have had something to say should the Confederates have actually taken the hill. So we can argue in favor of Chamberlain for a variety of reasons. I think the big thing, though, with Chamberlain is that he walks around after the war and tells people that he saves the Union Army at Gettysburg. And for that, I think that's also why he's first on this list. Maybe, but it's questionable whether he saved the Union Army on the second day. It's questionable whether he saved Little Round Top even. So I think maybe this was the obvious one and the toughest one to evaluate. There is one bottom line, though. The flank is secured, and Chamberlain and his 20th Maine do make one of the more fantastic stands in the entire war. So we do need to take that into consideration. The next name on the list is Winfield Scott Hancock. I think uniquely, with the exception of Meade, Hancock can say he has an impact on all 3 days of the battle. So does he get to have the moniker of saving the Union 3 times? Maybe, maybe not. The first day, Meade is going to send Hancock ahead of the rest of the army to check on the situation. Now, this is mostly because he trusts Hancock, and the news of Reynolds having been killed had made it back to the main column of the Union Army. Let's face it, the prospect of having Oliver O. Howard taking the fate of your tenure as Army commander into his hands might not have been the most welcoming of news, especially, whether it's deserving or not, following the reputation that Howard and his corps receives at Chancellorsville. Hancock's best contribution, though, would be to sort of just agree with Howard and what he has already put together, although he did flex that he was taking the reins of the situation on the ground, at least until Slocum shows up with his 12th Corps. Hancock would do well to assist in the organization of what would become the Union defensive line, the famous fishhook. His 2nd Corps, though, would be tried to its fullest on the 2nd and 3rd day of the battle. We will talk about Sickles shortly, but when the Confederate attack launches, there is a mad scramble amongst the Union forces. Hancock is going to, at some point in the day, take over for the crumbling 3rd Corps, which was not going to be an easy task. As we know, the 3rd Corps is going to essentially cease to exist after this battle. This is going to be the crisis point on the 2nd day. Hancock has to send off Caldwell into the wheat field, and then he has to deal with Barksdale and Wilcox, who are both in danger of rolling up Cemetery Ridge. He will organize the defense of the ridge a day before the more famous defense and energetically make sure it does not fall into Confederate hands. It's questionable as to which one goes first, but he's going to throw in the 1st Minnesota and then George Willard in his redemption attack, which claims his life. These will be tough choices to make. He will then have to pivot and face Rand's right and his Georgians as they attack relatively over the same ground that Pickett and Pettigrew are going to go over the next day. Samuel Sprigg Carroll is routed just in time to solidify the situation, and the Union center remains intact until the 3rd day. It would be the 2nd Corps that would receive the famous Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble charge. If you go to Gettysburg, you can actually find the spot where Hancock is wounded as he is directing the Vermont Brigade to get into position to pour flanking fire into the attacking Confederates. It would actually surprise you to see how far in front of the lines he is when he gets wounded. Now, low be it for me to compare, but we have a lot of critical situations that Hancock is responding to on the 2nd day versus the one critical situation that Chamberlain is facing at Little Round Top. Wilcox, probably more than Barksdale, in my mind, would have been a real problem if left without anyone to stop his command. Had there been a little bit more initiative from the Confederate 3rd Corps and additional troops thrown in, then it might have been overwhelming even for the amount of regiments that Hancock is able to find. Pickett's charge is the critical situation of the battle. If we look at Hancock, we have a strong argument that he is presiding over the Union operations over 3, maybe 2.5 of the main crisis points on 3 days of combat at Gettysburg, which is a very strong argument. But does he have a negative? Well, one that I think is pretty big is Hancock has a big disagreement with the artillery on July 3rd. While they hold their fire, he wants to have them return the Confederate bombardment. We will talk artillery shortly, but considering how close the assault in the center comes to success, every bit that goes toward its repulse helps. You could also probably have chalking up in the negative category that Hancock doesn't really do a whole lot on the 1st day, but I would also sort of argue that he's kind of a net zero on the first day because he doesn't hinder anything either. So there is that. Our next name is Oliver O. Howard. In some ways, Howard might be a problem because of his 11th Corps. I think, unfortunately, we have that perception of him because of the negative press that the 11th Corps receives, not only for Gettysburg, but probably more so for being the victim of the flank attack at Chancellorsville. Remember that Joe Hooker blames 3 people for the loss at Chancellorsville: George Stoneman, Uncle John Sedgwick, and, of course, Howard, and his 11th Corps specifically. It does not help that the 11th Corps was made up of mostly German immigrants, so they might have been an easier target. If you recall, Francis Barlow was more interested in becoming an officer of United States colored troops than remaining an officer for his German troops. That is kind of the hierarchy of things, if you will. Barlow would rather kind of go to this seemingly lesser command. You're probably not going to be seeing combat situations as much than remain where he was at the head of mostly German troops. So that kind of gives you an idea of things. But Howard can be separated from the 11th Corps, at least for the moment. He would actually be the primary commander on the ground for a period of time on the first day. John Fulton Reynolds was killed very early in the action, so with Abner Doubleday having taken over the 1st Corps, Howard, arriving with his 11th, would actually be the primary leader. Indeed, even with Hancock arriving, he would sort of defer to Howard when it comes to the decision-making. But what exactly does Howard do? Well, we know Howard will survey the field. With the 1st Corps already deployed on McPherson's Ridge, he will send out the 11th Corps. However, there would be a reserve kept on Cemetery Hill. We have it on good evidence that Howard also understood the good ground that was Cemetery Hill. I've also seen it argued that his line chosen for the 11th Corps might have actually been alright, but the deployment was wrong, which unfortunately leads to the exploitation of Barlow on his knoll. Ewell will smash the 11th Corps, which sees some troops turn in good performances, but this is also where we get the Howard does not know what he was doing criticism. The 1st and 11th Corps will retreat through town and then set up defensively on Cemetery Hill. Hancock was on the scene as mentioned, and of course, he has the special power to take over for Howard, and Howard initially offers some pushback, but he's going to cooperate. Now, given the circumstances, he might have made things difficult, as well as wasting some time, that at the very least could have been a detriment to the Union Army. So, we do have that in favor of Howard. Realizes the situation that everybody is in. It's not going to make things get difficult. This is kind of a new situation that the Union Army is in. Meade does have this special ability now. It didn't used to be like that. You would have to very strictly go by rank, but we do now have the ability to say, all right, even though this guy technically is lower in rank, I'm going to be able to give him the ability to now command the forces in the field. So we have that now. And Howard could have given some pushback here, but he decides not to. And so that is another positive that we have for Howard. And then you really don't hear very much of Howard for the rest of the engagement, right? So you do have that, and you don't have any negatives from here on out. And sometimes when you kind of make this impact, you have this good ground and you hold that ground. Obviously, Cemetery Hill is pushed on for July 2nd. There is a very concentrated effort that almost succeeds. But there is no failure on the part of the Union troops. So Howard, again, sometimes when you don't hear your name called, right, that is also a good thing. Our next name is, of course, John Buford. If you have listened to any of the Gettysburg content that I have rolled out, you know I'm pretty high on Buford. We can operate under the knowledge that both armies were aware that they would be fighting a battle. The answer was where. I think sometimes we kind of feel that Gettysburg was a complete surprise, when in reality it was on the short list for potential places the Army could actually make contact. Now, was Buford conspiring with Reynolds to force combat at this Pennsylvania town to make sure that the home state of the latter was defended? Probably not. But Buford, being the eyes of the army, would certainly see the ground on the southern part of the town and realize that this was an advantageous position. As such, it would be necessary to make sure that any Confederates would have to be delayed on their western and northern approaches so that the army could get up in time for Meade to take advantage of this ground. Later in the war, cavalry being used as a weapon against rebel infantry would be abnormal. In fact, these same troopers would be involved in some of the actions in 64 and 65. That's going to be pretty similar. So I think there is also something to be said with Buford using his cavalry in this manner dismounted. Leading up to the battle probably was the best experience, as Buford and his cavalry were constantly skirmishing with Stuart and the Gray troopers, so that might have had something to do with how things rolled out on July 1st. Realizing the importance of the ground and then realizing there needed to be time was also important for Buford. Time in a delaying action, first by the cavalry, then when the infantry arrived, a stand on the west and north of town. If the rebels are already in Gettysburg, the timetable, in my mind, probably does not work out. It is likely there is no Gettysburg without Buford. What does that mean exactly? Well, it's hard to say. Gettysburg is a Union victory, a costly one, but a Union victory. It is really easy to look back and have this kind of hindsight 2020, but it is also sort of cited as the first real victory that the Army of the Potomac has over Lee. And we know how things actually turn out in the end, but having this huge victory with all these casualties and this big morale swing, morale boost, the high water mark of the Confederacy, all of that is actually super important to how things roll out in the main theater of the war. Could that have happened elsewhere if there is no Gettysburg? Maybe, but hard to say. So we do have positives for Buford. Are there any negatives? Well, I think the only negative that you can really cite for Buford is that he kind of disappears. He has this action that happens on the 1st of July, and then he's sent away. So it might even be more of an argument for him if he has any kind of impact on East Cavalry Field on the 3rd day. But fortunately for Buford and his troopers, they've done enough after July 1st, and they are sent to guard some supply lines, right? So they're not going to participate anymore in Gettysburg. So I guess you could say that that is a negative. Next name is going to be Dan Sickles. Now, some of you might be sitting there and thinking, wait, Dan Sickles? Surely, if you were putting together a list of people who almost might lose the Battle of Gettysburg, you would put him on there, right? That might be true, but I also mentioned that this is a list not without its controversy, so Sickles is here. It is not without some sort of logic that Sickles, who is most likely writing under a pseudonym, defends his actions at Gettysburg and actually makes the claim that he does a lot to win the battle. In a weird way, had Sickles not advanced his corps and sacrificed them, then the Confederate attack might have jumped off and then just rolled up the line. Now, maybe it does not happen quite like that, but the fact that the 3rd Corps is in the way of the Confederates is going to allow time for the Union Army to react with artillery, and then with whatever infantry then can then respond, is sort of an argument that's fairly solid. Did Dan Sickles know that the Confederate flanking attempt was coming? I don't think so, but if you combine this failed attempt on the Union left, Culp's Hill, and then the failed attempt on Cemetery Hill on the Union right, then Lee's only move is going to be attack the Union center. So Sickles is sort of responsible for Pickett's charge in a very weird way. The bit negative for Dan Sickles, of course, is that he gets his corps pretty much destroyed. And a lot of negative things happen when it comes to Devil's Den, the wheat field. There's a lot of ground that is gained by the Confederate forces and their attack. So there is that. Governor Kimball Warren is going to be the next name on this list. G.K. Warren is going to uncover the movements of the Confederates getting into position for their famous attack on the 2nd day. he will start the chain of events to get troops into position on Little Round Top. Without Warren, there is no Chamberlain because simply there would not have been Union troops on the hill to begin with. But there lies, I think, really the importance of Warren. If there are no Union troops on the hill, then there is no diverting the rebel attack. Now, this is partly also because Hood is wounded early in the attack. I think that has a lot to do with that, but Law and the Texas Brigade would spend time attacking Little Round Top. Now, also, you could point out that Hood is probably wounded by artillery pieces that have been rolled into position either on Little Round Top or in the vicinity of where the 3rd Corps is, what have you. So there is a lot of additional argument that Warren does a lot to, in his kind of ringing in the alarm bell here, does a lot to making sure that this Confederate attack gets off track. Once Strong Vincent's brigade is on top of Little Round Top, they are going to pour some fire into Law's command and that Hood's command as well, and they are going to actually draw them over to Little Round Top, and that's actually not going to be where the attack was supposed to go. So that is going to definitely play a huge factor into what happens in that portion of the field on the second day. Now, what would have happened if Hood had maintained control? Could Little Round Top have been diverted? It's hard to say, but if you look at a map, Hood can use those brigades to swing past Devil's Den and start rolling up through the wheat field and toward Birney. We know that things do not really go well for the 3rd Corps in general at Gettysburg, but hastening the downfall of that corps would have been a problem for the Union Army. That probably happens if there are no Union troops on Little Round Top, and that for me lies the significance in Warren. An unsung argument for Warren, too, is that he declines the Chief of Staff offer from Meade in favor of Butterfield. Now, why exactly is that important? Well, Warren would have been at a disadvantage, and thus Meade at a disadvantage, whereas at least Butterfield is aware of the army in the critical days before the battle and during the battle. This is also something that maybe we don't really think of. What's really a negative for Warren? Well, if you don't really think that Little Round Top is all that important, and if you don't really think that necessarily things would have turned out too differently had Little Round Top happened or not, well, I guess that could be a counter-argument for Warren. Next name is going to be George Gordon Meade. There is definitely an argument to be made that George Gordon Meade has a lot of Gettysburg, essentially the product of circumstance for him. Meade, of course, takes over the Army of the Potomac and has a very minimal amount of time before he is forced to fight the largest battle of the war. He wants to fight a defensive battle on the Pipe Creek line in Maryland, but of course, things do not shake out that way. Now Meade will do a good job during the battle of plugging in his officers where he thinks he needs them, notably Hancock, whom he trusts. Did he trust Reynolds? Well, we're going to cover that in a moment. Hancock is going to be bouncing all over the place. When Sickles is going to get into his situation on day 2, he will do everything in his power to try to salvage the situation. Now, I'm sure maybe some of you listening have been in a scenario before where somebody has done something extremely frustrating to you, and maybe you are not really familiar with that person, so it might be really easy to maybe blow up at them. So Meade, we can probably very much relate to that, but Meade is going to do a decent job of trying to just get past that and try to make things better and honestly try to make sure it's not a complete disaster once things start rolling downhill. Now you could probably argue if Meade was forced to come up with a battle plan as opposed to reacting to what Lee is throwing at him, the Battle of Gettysburg might not be the same. Is he the LeBron in this situation? Probably not. But is he a Team USA Jason Kidd? Probably a more apt comparison. You probably didn't think I was going to pull out a Jason Kidd reference for George Gordon Meade, but there you go. Now, Meade does have his Conference of Officers, which was a little controversial at the time, and is sometimes controversial now. On the positive side, he had just taken over command of an army, and he needs to get his ducks in a row. And even though he asked for everyone's opinion, at the end of the day, he still makes the decision himself. So there is that. But on the flip side of that, having just taken over and then asking everyone's opinion on how to proceed, that's probably not really inspiring confidence either. So that is kind of a negative as well. So you can probably get either side on the vote of things. Overall, though, you can kind of see some pretty stark positives and negatives for Meade. Is he reacting to a lot of things? Yeah. But is he also doing a really good job of filtering things and kind of meeting crises as they arise? Also, yeah. So definitely a strong contender on the list. Here we have some dark horses. These, I think, are people that maybe we don't often think about. They're probably not the favorites, but I think probably still some strong contenders. Henry Hunt and Freeman McGilvery. These are two names you probably didn't think of, and so they are going to start the dark horse list. Artillery becomes important on the second and third days of the battle. Henry Hunt is going to have his hand in events being slightly evolved in conferring with Dan Sickles when Sickles wanted to move up his corps to the high ground in front of him. Hunt, of course, was in other battles of our story, being one of the premier artillery officers. He sort of gets sidelined for Joe Hooker, but he's back for Gettysburg. Freeman McGilvery would put together artillery which would form the Plum Run line, which would also be important in stopping the rebels as they tried to turn and roll up the Federal center. We talked about that in our narrative episodes briefly. This is why I think we really can point to a combination of maybe a couple of figures. Freeman McGilvery is important to solidifying the center. Importantly, by this point, Barksdale's command is pretty well spent. Infantry filtered in by Hancock will also add to making sure Cemetery Ridge is not taken, but importantly, at one point in the battle, there is only artillery to deal with a potential breakthrough, which, again, McGilvery provides. Henry Hunt really has a big impact on the third day. He holds artillery fire while the Confederates attempt to soften the position or have their fire be counter-battery effective. This might seem simple, but then saving the artillery would mean that there would be more availability to receive the charge, and at this point, even the usually better supplied Union Army was seeing supplies begin to dwindle. The artillery is really going to be a big reason why the Pickett Pettigrew Trimble charge fails. So Henry Hunt holds the fire for max effect, and I think that's quite important. Additionally, he has them give the illusion that they've been knocked out, or has concealed batteries add to the repulse, such as that little round top, which I think are also big contributions. So what's the drawback? Well, artillery is sometimes overlooked. Certainly I find myself doing that when doing the rundowns of some of these battles. The next name is George Sears Green. Now, for a lot of arguments you might make against anyone on Little Round Top, you can probably make the same arguments for anyone on Culp's Hill. Probably doubly so for Culp's Hill because exactly why was anyone fighting on Culp's Hill in the first place? Unlike Little Round Top, you could not even put artillery on it. What I would argue that the Union troops on this part of the line, extending to Spangler's Spring, take up the attentions and efforts of Confederate troops who otherwise might have been deployed elsewhere. So to that effect, the able defense of Culp's Hill adds to the importance of the Union victory, and who does that credit belong to? Well, I would say that George Sears Green is the individual who probably deserves that moniker. It would be his brigade who would be given the task of holding Culp's Hill early on, and they would be relatively isolated. So Green would have his men dig in. Behind earthworks, they would have a defense that would repulse Confederate attacks, keeping Culp's Hill in the hands of the Federals. Also, if you are trying to piece together how Gettysburg has a little bit of everything, the fact that George Sears Green is going to give us earthworks, we can definitely chalk that one up in the win column for him, right? Next name is going to be George Willard. Willard might be a confusing name on this list. And among a few names on this list that will die during the battle. This one will probably take the most jogging of memory and explaining, as perhaps it's also a little unsung. As discussed, Willard would have his brigade thrown into the repulse of Barksdale, and probably a little bit of Wilcox. Now, Willard, as we mentioned, has a brigade of New York regiments. He would begin the second day of Gettysburg around the Bryan Farm. This was a 1,500 or so man brigade, the Harper's Ferry Cowards. Remember, these individuals had been part of that garrison during the Antietam campaign. They had been part of the garrison that had surrendered and thus had taken on this moniker, this kind of stigma with them, so they're hoping to gain some redemption. Among them is going to be the 39th New York, which was one of the more nationally diverse regiments, the Garibaldi Guard, being part of this regiment. Now, Willard and also the 1st Minnesota would be thrown into combat to check these Confederates that are going to be assaulting across the Harrisburg Road. Wool's New Yorkers are going to check the Mississippi troops advancing toward the Confederates receiving artillery fire from the Peach Orchard. This is where Willard is going to be struck with a shell that takes off part of his face, killing him instantly. Elijah Sherrill, who was wounded at Harper's Ferry, would take over the brigade and be wounded on the 3rd day, wounds that are going to prove mortal, also being part of that redemption arc. Willard might be a combination candidate with the rest of his brigade. If you look at a map, they had to go a long distance to not only get to the fighting, but then go a good distance further to repulse and then drive the Confederates when they were the only infantry available. The next names are David McMurtry Grade and George Armstrong Custer. If the cavalry portion of Gettysburg is the make or break portion of the battle, then here we are. Could Stuart really have smashed into the rear of the Federal position at Cemetery Ridge? If we operate under the assumption that yes, this is a thing that could have happened, then David McMurtry Gregg definitely deserves to be on the dark horse list. When we think cavalry at Gettysburg, you probably think of Custer, and he does lead some pretty brave charges. However, the architect and authorizer of Custer's moves at East Cavalry Field is going to be Gregg. Gregg's division, with Custer's attached brigade, would successfully check Stuart, who had finally arrived on the field toward the end of the 2nd day. Custer does not come up with the idea of defense at East Cavalry Field, but he does execute the orders, and he does valiantly lead a charge that will break the enemy troopers. So we can combine both of these individuals together, being Gregg and Custer. But again, the big negative with them is that if you have this cavalry action, you're not a believer that maybe this is the most significant part of the battle and doesn't necessarily make or break the battle, then, well, that would be a big negative. The last dark horse we have is Samuel Crawford. Now, you could hear that name and be like, what? Why? Well, he does counterattack across Bloody Run with his reserves, and he does check Wofford and the other Confederate forces that had just swept the wheat field. We just talked about how important that was and how Wofford was important to that success in the wheat field. As such, he does have a statue at Gettysburg holding a flag that he actually just ripped away from one of his own soldiers. But the problem with Crawford is while he does check the Confederates, there's a lot of what-ifs. The 6th Corps had reinforced the southern part of the field, so how many gains would they actually had is questionable. And even so, Longstreet most likely is the one who calls off the attack in the evening hours. So there are a couple of different arguments there. There is a lot of variables to consider. So let's close out with some honorable mentions. I think these need to be in their own category because there is some kind of circumstance that I think really does take away from our main list. Neither, though, are they really dark horses for that matter. I think these individuals are a little more in the weeds, but once again, they're deserving of at least some conversation. The first one is John Gibbon. With all these individuals, I see a positive, but also something that maybe detracts. With Gibbon, he does set up the defense that repulses the primary part of Pickett's charge. We can also probably say that part of his division is responsible for meeting some of the initial attempts on the 2nd day at Gettysburg on Cemetery Ridge. But there is an assist necessary from Alexander Hayes' division to solidify the Union center. Webb's brigade will briefly break when faced with the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble charge, But then again, Hayes is also taking the brunt of the Pettigrew Trimble part, so maybe it should be John Gibbon, Alexander Hayes. That could be a detraction in that the charge almost works. But the main point that I think is the asterisk for me, for Gibbon, is that he's kind of just there. The infantry will be undercover for the rebel bombardment and then be prepared well enough to receive the attack. But does Gibbon really do a whole lot to affect the outcome of the charge? That's a little bit debatable in my opinion. But he's going to land on this list because, again, he is the one who receives and then repulses the Confederates in probably the most critical moment of the battle. John Reynolds is our next name. A lot of why the battle is fought at Gettysburg is sometimes put at the feet of John Reynolds, but a drawback for him is going to be that he does not have a very big impact in the course of the battle. There is a lot of questions I have seen back and forth of how much operational control did Reynolds have of where the battle was going to be, etc., etc. A big contribution, I believe, to the Union victory, which we can really argue for Reynolds, is that he truly trusts the opinion of John Buford. Motivation be what it may, fighting the battle on Pennsylvania soil as opposed to Meade's Maryland defense maybe, Reynolds will understand and trust the eyes and ears of the army in the cavalry of the Army of the Potomac. He will begin to the deployment of the command on McPherson's Ridge, which would eventually be a strong position that will hold off for some time the advancing troops under A.P. Hill. Unfortunately for Reynolds, and why he is in this section, is that he will be killed almost immediately in this portion of the action. As I mentioned previously, when you look at the accounts from the Iron Brigade, they're literally just getting into line when Reynolds goes down, as it's very early into the fight. Now you can also argue that once the battle is underway with infantry, this will set the entire events in motion that becomes Gettysburg. Reynolds could easily have been dismissive of Buford, or decided he was going to wait for Meade, or made a decision that does not bring on a general engagement at Gettysburg, which of course leads us back to the question of how much trust did he have? How much leeway did he have? Again, kind of like Crawford, there are a lot of variables to consider. And finally, the last honorable mention is Strong Vincent. I'm not sure if I can really have a list like this and include Joshua Chamberlain and Warren, but exclude Strong Vincent. A drawback for Chamberlain, though, is that there are a handful of other individuals that at least share some of the credit for the successful defense of Little Round Top, Strong Vincent being amongst them. But a lot of those who might have shared in that credit and glory, like Vincent, do not survive Gettysburg. Vincent is going to send Chamberlain into position, into the spot where he gets his glory, so there is that, and he will be commanding the rest of the veteran brigade as it repulses the attack on the main face of Little Round Top. But just as we can say with Chamberlain that there are those who might get some credit, so spreading that around is also a detractor here, and the same detractor we can say with Warren, likewise we can add into Vincent, in that Little Round Top might have not been the most strategically important spot on the battlefield. So, not to sound too much like a broken record, but there are things that we've already mentioned that are pros and cons for Vincent. So now we have listed all of our candidates. I think we can stop there for today. Hopefully we have a good list to go off of in terms of making your decision. I have tried to get a good pro and con for most everyone, so it's fairly balanced. Remember too that I fully believe we can combine some of these two, perhaps. I'm going to have a sub-episode where I will give you my thought process on who exactly is the savior of the Union Army at Gettysburg. But our next full episode, we're actually going to return to Bull Run, and another different type of episode, we're actually going to compare 1st and 2nd Manassas. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.